Okay, now we're going to look at a more complicated model and really see how the tree structure works and how we can set up a very general strategy for rendering these complex models. What we're going to do is look at a humanoid figure. You know, it might be a robot, it might be a little animated character, and we're going to look at how we can describe that tree. Then we'll look at how two different basic ways of trying to traverse the tree. Remember, the idea is that once I have this graph structure and I've stored geometry at each node, I have to visit every one of those nodes, hopefully just once, and draw the geometry that I find there and make sure I've got every one visited. And we'll see a very general way of doing this. What I want to do is get a traversal strategy that's independent of the particular model. We'll see a very straightforward way where you take the model and you go through it and you render each part of it, but it turns out we can have a much more general strategy where we use the same little piece of rendering code every time. So here's our figure that we're going to work on. We're going to say the torso is the root node because everything is attached to it, and we attach a head to it. And I'm going to use in my model, just again to make the code a little bit simpler, when you look up this code under, I think it's figure.html and figure.js in chapter 9, you'll be able to play with it. I'll show it to you in a minute. And so you've got a head, you've got two arms, two legs. Each arm and each leg are divided into two parts, an upper arm and a lower arm. So let's take a little look at it right now. So let me go over here and take a look. Okay, now, so here's the little model here. And because the torso is the root, that as you rotate the torso, everything follows it as it rotates. If the head, now what I've done on the head is give you two angles to play with, so you can sort of, if you think of it as your head, you can go side to side, and you could turn it. So here's one of the ways, turning it left to right, and here's what does this do? This should tip it forward and back, and that's what it's doing. Unlike our heads, I've been able to flip it completely over. And then you can control each of the arms and the upper and the lower part of it. And again, it's all hierarchical because as I rotate the torso, it's carrying along everything else with it. So you can play with this, and actually it's fairly simple to actually animate this. Again, this goes all the way around. It's articulated, and every one of the joints, except for the head, which has two joints, they all have a single joint. So the joints are just like what we had on our earlier model. So let's see how we can go about actually doing some code that generates that and traverses the structure. Okay, so here we are back. So here's our model. Looks pretty much like that. Okay, so we can build it out of anything you want. One of the nice things about doing this is, since all of the individual parts are described by functions, if you want to take my model and make it a little more realistic, or you want to use some other parts, all you have to do is replace the code for the different parts: torso, left upper arm, right upper leg, and so on. Once more, there's going to be a matrix associated with each of the nodes, which tells me how I position that particular node with respect to its parents. So the left lower arm node matrix only has to worry about how the left lower leg, or left lower arm, this should be arm, this should say arm here. So what did I just do here? This should say arm here, not leg. It just is worried about how it positions to its parents. And one thing to point out is that when you look at this and consider a hierarchy, this we'll be talking about next time when we talk about scene graphs, is this is just part of some bigger scene. And so there's a matrix associated with the root node that positions it with respect to the world that you're trying to build up, and we'll take advantage of that when we start talking about scene graphs, where we have much more general things, where we have lights and viewers and cameras and multiple objects in it. But now let's just talk about our one object here. So we've got the idea that each node's geometry is described by a simple function, and there's a matrix also that tells us how do we position that geometry with respect to its parent. So here's the model drawn as a tree with those matrices being shown. Now, the way I've shown it here, the matrices can be included on the links or included in the node. We're going to include them in the node. So there's a matrix that relates the head to the torso, the left upper arm to the torso, a matrix that positions and orients the left lower arm with respect to the left upper arm, and so on for the other arm and the two legs. And notice that this structure, it's pretty easy to say, well, what about the hands and the feet? Well, all you have to do is add the hands and the feet down here. So this tree structure is very, very flexible to add more and more parts. And you can add hands and fingers and tools and other things. Okay, now remember that I said there were two angles for the head, so I can go left to right and twist my neck about the up direction. So there's two angles here. There's an angle for rotating the whole torso, and then there's one angle for each of the upper and the lower arms and legs. So I've got 8 angles here, 9, 10, 11 angles that determine the model. So the entire position of this and orientation of this model, once you built it, is just an array of 11 angles that I used during the rendering. Okay, now the hard part is, how do I take that structure and traverse it? Now, it's not hard if you've taken any simple data structures or data structure course on how to do that. There are various ways, and I'll make some comments. I'll help remember at the end of the lecture that the ways do matter. That when you study tree structures, you study different ways to traverse the tree, and there's a potential in graphics for if you traverse the tree in a different manner, even though you'll visit every one of the nodes, visually you might see something different. Let me talk about that now before we get to, so I don't forget, is one of the problems that occurs with all of this is the issue of state. And it's a little better now because most of the state variables have been deprecated in desktop OpenGL and in WebGL. The problem was if you set a state variable, say like green, and one of the things you did, that's the color you want to render in, and you traverse the tree in some order, and maybe you set green over here, then when you came down and traversed all these others, well, they're going to be green too, if it's part of the state. Well, if you traverse it in a different order, and suppose you set red over here, and now you traverse it so you go, instead of going from the things on the right here to the left, now all of these guys over here get colored red until you hit the green over here, while before they all were green until you hit the red over here. And that's sort of an unintended consequence of having state variables which are not tied very tightly to the geometry, and then we'll see that again when we talk about scene graphs. And it's one of the reasons that most of the state variables have been deprecated, because these unintended changes are really problematic. As we'll look at the strategy, you'll see one of the things you can do with those kinds of state variables or attributes is to have stacks where you save them on stacks so you don't do that. But it's always been a problem in developing graphics applications to get unintended consequences of having changed states, which is persistent. Anything that sort of has the title current color or current model view or current this or that has the danger of not being changed or being changed and remaining when you think it's something else. Okay, so we'll see a little more of that later. Okay, so we have to traverse the tree, visiting every node once, display the geometry at that node to get the correct position, orientation, of that part. Usually there's an instance transformation associated with the object, so you're not really doing any scaling here. You're just positioning it, rotating and translating it to get it in the right position relative to its parent. It still has its own instance transformation stored with it. Okay, so there's 10 matrices as we saw in that diagram. You can think of a model view matrix coming in from the outside that positions the root node, the torso, with respect to the whole scene. Then all the others are relative to that matrix. So MH positions the head with respect to that torso, and likewise for the lower and the upper arms positioning with respect to their parents. All the ones that are upper arms and upper legs are positioned relative to the torso. Lower arms and lower legs are positioned relative to their parent upper arms and upper legs. Okay, so here's the idea of using a stack to traverse, which is something that when you learn about trees, you learn as you traverse the tree in some way. You store information on the stack and then pop it out when you need. See, one of the things I could do in principle would be every time I get to a node, I can compute this matrix that's relevant for that mode, much like what we saw in the example of just the robot arm. The problem is that there's a lot of matrix multiplication going on if I'm going to have to build everything up from scratch each time, or else I'm going to apply, so here's an example that if you set the model view matrix, you get this matrix M passed in. Here's the matrix MMH is what you need to draw the head. Now if I go down and say, well, I'm going to draw the left upper arm first, which is look at the tree again briefly. So I could say, okay, I get this matrix M, I go down to the head, and I draw the head by multiplying M times MH. Now I come back up to the torso because there's nothing else down here to draw. Now I'm up to the left upper arm. Well, what's the matrix that applies here? It's M times LUA. Well, I just modified M to be M times MH. What do? Well, I can start all over again and apply M and then MLUA, or I can take the product and think about applying the inverse. That's generally not a very efficient thing to do. But a better solution is to use a stack. That if when I come down here, I push M on a stack because I'm going to need it again when I come back up and start going down again. So I do a push, then I pop it back out again. Now I have M, I haven't done any real work, and now I can multiply by MLUA. This part down here looks like the single robot arm. I can then multiply by MLLA, draw the left lower arm, come all the way back up again. I'm finished with this little subtree. Come back up again, and now I can pop, what I had to do here, when I go down here, I automatically pop M back on the stack. I popped it, push it back on the stack. I pushed it to get when I went down here. I popped it when I came back here. Now, when I come down here, I better push it because I'm going to need it when I go down these subtrees over here. So I come back up here, I pop it again, I also push it again to save it for later, and then keep going like that. So this pushing and popping is going to make things much, much more efficient to do. So we use this idea of a matrix stack to do that. So the code looks something like this, that you push the model view matrix, you draw the torso, and you're going to see these paired pups. So you pushed it on. Now, this is what I said a minute ago. You pop it back up. Now you've got M again. You better push it because you're going to need it again later. Then you start working on the left upper arm, and then there's always going to be this paired. Pop the matrix back to get it, to get M again. Push it back on. And if it's a more complicated structure, you can see how the flow is going to go. Now, one of the nice things in JavaScript is that the push and pop are automatic. They're attached. They're inherited from the prototype way up in the chain. So everybody's got a push and a pop. And we've used that a little bit before when we did matrices. And attributes, we push things onto arrays, and we could pop them off later to get them. We do this with matrices now. Okay, so what's the problem with this? Well, the problem with this is that it's a particular tree. This code here says, well, what you did is write a traversal for that tree that was based on that particular tree. You know, where this push and pop are and where these matrices are is totally dependent on the particular tree. So there's nothing very general about this, even though it works and it's moderately efficient. I also, you know, again, this is the remark I made a few minutes ago, that if there's other things going on like colors and other state kind of variables, you could better watch out. And so traditionally what you did in the pre-deprecation desktop GL is not only did you have a function called push matrix and pop matrix, you also had functions called push attributes and pop attributes, which you'd probably also do at that time, although that could really slow you down. Now that that stuff has been deprecated and the pushes and the pops are built in and colors and other kinds of state variables, texture coordinates are all vertex attributes, you can handle that in a slightly different way, but it shouldn't be a problem. Okay, so what about if you want to do this more generally? I want to have a structure that I can use to represent this tree, and it's going to depend on how I describe what's in a node. And the structure we're going to use is called a left child, right sibling structure. It's going to use linked lists for the children and the siblings of a given node to write out to describe that tree. So in C++ terms, each node would have two pointers associated with it. In JavaScript, you don't use the terminology of pointers, but it's essentially the same. So on the left side of each node, there's a pointer to the next node in the tree. The left is the next nodes. Right is going to be a linked list of the children. So the node sort of looks like this. Here's a picture. So on the left, here's the root. It goes down to the children of that tree. So there's three children of this node. Okay, one has no children of its own. The other has two children. Okay, let's look down here. So you go down the root. You go left. You get down to this first child. This first child has two siblings. Okay, so they're described here and here. The dot is saying null is a null for there being no more children. Now you go down to the next child of that root node. That has no children, so there's a null here, and then there's a pointer here to the third child of the root node, and it has three children, which are in this linked list. So you can think of this in terms of data structures is that there's a linked list, but the entries in one of the entries in the linked list is another linked list, a pointer to a linked list, and the other entry is a pointer to the next entry in the children linked list. So you have essentially three linked lists in this example. So this is a pretty general structure, and I'll show you the code for that in a second. So at each node, you've got a pointer to the sibling, a pointer to a child, which is a node itself, and then you also have to have the information about drawing it. Back up here, I didn't say anything about the geometry. Well, that's also going to be in that node, so I'll make room for that for a function that draws that geometry, and also the matrix that carries me from the parent to the child, which is a homogeneous coordinate matrix, which we just store with our matrix type, and we just store as a matrix on the application side, we'll store it using our matrix type, which is essentially represents it as a 1D array. Okay, so here's how you create a node. So if I look at what my program is going to do, my program is going to start off by creating this structure. So I just describe all of the nodes. Now I've got what, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 parts. So I've got 10 node creations that go on, and what I'm going to do is create a node by this function, and it's going to have in it a transform, a render, how I that's the geometry. Render is the geometry. And a sibling and a child, and if there's no sibling and no child, that's just going to be null. So I really can create each node. This returns a node by simply passing in the transform, the function that renders this geometry, and the name or pointer to the sibling and the child. Okay, so here's an example, part of the example. So what I do if you look in the code is I give it an ID. So the ID is going to be the ID of each of the parts: head, torso, left upper arm, and so on. I get a matrix. Well, I'm just going to start off with an empty homogeneous coordinate matrix. I'm going to use a case statement, switch on the name that I put in. So here's, if I have the torso, what do I do with the torso? I've got to rotate it by the angle associated with it. And now I create the node using that, passing in that matrix. A pointer to this function torso. This torso is the name of the function that describes the geometry, and then its child is the head. Okay, so it has no siblings, but it has a child. The first one is the head. Likewise, for the head, I have a little more complex geometry because I have to position it with respect to the torso. So you need to know the height. So when I draw the head, I need to know its height. And this is just telling me how to position it with respect to the torso. Then I do a rotation based on these two angles, and I modify the present model view matrix. For that, I then do a multiplication, and I draw out create that node. So here's basically just, you go through it node by node by node, telling it exactly the information it needs. Where's the geometry? How do I relate it to its parents, and what does it have any siblings or children? And you just go, look at the example and go through the code. But that's it. These functions are a little ugly because they're describing a torso, head, or describing the geometry, but conceptually they're very, very simple. Okay, so now how do you animate this? Just by changing the angles, the 11 angles in theta, which is what you saw, and then it forms the required matrix and does this. Now, what about the traversal? We've just done the description. So for any theta, I have the description. I interact with it. I've got a theta. What about the rendering? Well, that's the traversal. I built the structure for this particular model. The renderer is incredibly simple. This is sort of my favorite part of this. This will traverse any of the tree. It's known as a pre-order traversal, but it'll traverse anything described using our nodes. Okay, so there's a traversal here. So what do we do if we traverse? If it's a null node, we simply stop. Here, if we go on, then we're going to save the model view matrix. Every time I go down, I have to save that model view matrix. I then modify the model view matrix by the transform I found for that particular node. So here's the ID of that node. I use its transform. I draw its geometry once I've updated the model view matrix. Then I check if it's got a child. If it has a child, then I just recursively call the traverse with the ID of the child. If it doesn't have a child, I go on. Once I finish with any children, I eventually come back over here, apply the model view matrix from the stack, and then render the next node. Okay, so this is and which will get pushed back on up when I come into the next node. So this traversal is based on the node structure, but it has absolutely nothing to do with the particular model that I built up. And now the render function is trivial. I just clear, I do a traversal, starting off with the ID of the torso, the parent node, and then I just call myself. So that part is incredibly simple, incredibly flexible. So this is a really nice way to build up models. One or two final comments is that, as I've said, this applies to any left child, right sibling tree. This is the popping that we saw. Again, just a reminder that if there are any state variables you've set, if you did a different traversal algorithm, there are lots of different traversal algorithms for this standard kind of tree, you might have some problems with state changes. So again, a reminder: be careful. The final remark is that in JavaScript, everything is dynamic, so you can change anything at any time. You want to put a different tool, add a tool to the end of an arm, you can just change that tree anytime you want. If you want to change how you're modeling something, you want to replace the parallel pipets by cylinders, you can change it at any time because JavaScript, it's interpreted, everything is dynamic. So we can add and delete nodes. If you want to put a tool on and then take a tool off, you can add and delete nodes from the structure. If you were doing this in desktop GL, say in C++, the only difference you would make is to use pointers in the structure rather than nodes. So when you would define everything in terms of pointers to nodes. Then the traversal algorithm becomes completely dynamic, and you can add and delete nodes as much as you like. So this is a very powerful idea. If you're still looking for projects at this point, doing something with this is certainly you can get some really good projects out of this. Now we're going to extend this idea to go beyond geometry. Everything we've done now is just describing geometry, which has a hierarchical structure. What about if we want to go beyond just the geometry?